and welcome to Faculty Friday. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. And today it's my great pleasure to be talking with my colleague, George DeMartino, wonderful scholar, teacher, and colleague here, about a topic that may seem a little nerdy, but it's really one of profound importance, which is the possibly quite negative impact of economists on both domestic and international policy. Professor DeMartino is Professor of International Economics here at the Korbel School and co-director of our MA program in Global Economic Affairs. He's been on the faculty here since 1993. George earned his BA at Harvard University, an MA in Industrial Relations at Warwick University, and a PhD at the University of Massachusetts. Importantly, prior to entering academia, George was a labor organizer for AFSCME and the AFL-CIO. We'll talk a bit about that shortly. George is the author of several books on the ethics of economic policy and of the economics profession. And most recently, the topic we'll focus a lot on, he's the author of this book, hold it up, The Tragic Science, with a subtitle, How Economists Do Harm Even as They Aspire to Do Good. Really looking forward to the conversation. Welcome, George.
Well, thank you very much, Fritz, for this opportunity.
So you, George, you were sometimes described as a heterodox economist, someone who's been critical of the mainstream of economic thinking and practice, and skeptical and of its in many ways. But I was wondering if you might talk. As it turns out, you and I ended up discovering that we were actually in the same class in economics as freshmen in college. So. We've taken different journeys to this point in time, but I'm curious how your background, and particularly maybe your work as a labor organizer, actually shaped your relationship to the profession.
Oh, sure. I think my relationship to the profession was already a little fraught by the time I left college, even before I went to work for the labor movement, in the sense that when we were studying Econ Ec 10, the basic introductory course, the material didn't resonate for me. It's not that I didn't understand it, it's that I couldn't relate to it. And on some level, it actually made me angry. Its way of making sense of the world and of the economy. And so I went off to look for alternative ways to study the economy. And I came across a Marxist professor who happened to be teaching only graduate courses, but I appealed to him. This was Bill Lazanik. He is a great economic historian, and he let me take his classes. And by the end of my senior year, I'd become really excited about this alternative way of making sense that comes to us from the Marxian tradition. And that's what then launched me to want to go to work in the labor movement. I entered the labor movement in '78. By 1980, Ronald Reagan is elected, but Margaret Thatcher by then is prime minister. And suddenly we see this move away from the standard Keynesian state-led kind of economic model toward this market fundamentalism. And I'm working in the labor movement, and I'm starting to see the devastating impacts in the early 80s. And I'm wondering how it could be that our profession is advocating these policies that are so clearly damaging to working people. That's what then led me to go to the University of Massachusetts, where I could study alternatives, both the mainstream, but these alternatives that, in my view, did a better job of taking account of how economies work.
Yeah, and that's just I think sort of a useful background to understand sort of where you're coming from and the frame of reference that you have, and that's carried through a lot of your writings. And we don't have time to go through, the many things you've published. But so let's get to the book that you've just published. You argue that economists do harm. That may be a little shocking to people. So let's just start with, all right, what harms have economists caused in the sense that they have actually influenced public policies that then have had negative effects? What are some of the things that sort of, you mentioned one just in passing, but what are some of the other things?
Well, let's take some of the biggest changes in economic policy of our generation. So, the shift toward trade liberalization, which really gathered momentum in the 1990s, this idea that the world would be best served and we would all ultimately prosper were we to take down the barriers that prevent the free flow of goods, but also finance. This is critically important. So, it wasn't just free trade, it was about investment and financial flows. The idea was if we could just bind all the world's economies into one unified market economy, we would generate a level of prosperity and efficiency the world could never otherwise attain. And we would, in fact, reach the end of economic history. That is to say, there'd be no more need to experiment with economic regimes because we would have installed the one uniquely appropriate kind of regime. There was so much energy behind this project among the leading lights in our profession, Fritz, yours and mine, in the 1980s, 1990s, and in the early 2000s. It was impossible for those heterodox voices to be heard. Well, what's the scorecard? The scorecard is that some countries did okay under this regime, and a lot of countries suffered devastating harm, including those who should have been the principal beneficiaries. That is, economic theory was telling us that the primary beneficiaries were going to be the low-skilled workers in the emerging market economies. And we find that, in fact, nowadays, when the new studies indicate, well, no, it was the skilled workers almost everywhere who benefited. The owners of capital benefited almost everywhere. And in many, many places, communities were destroyed, lives were destroyed. Not just livelihoods, lives were lost in pursuit of this kind of market mania. I'll end here on this, but the costs are immense, almost incalculable, even while there were beneficiaries.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you and I could, we might actually have some disagreement on the net effects, but where I'm sure we agree is on the vast inequality and the incidence of benefits. For sure in that space. And I know you cite in your book a number of other examples, the hubris of the economists who are advising the former Soviet Union, Russia, and to move really rapidly into markets to privatize, et cetera. And
the estimates are that 10 million young Russian men lost their lives. These were extra deaths, 10 million extra deaths as a consequence of this headlong rush into privatization without ameliorating the harms that were created. That is an enormous number of people, if that number is even approximately correct.
Yeah. We'll touch on other examples that you bring up in the book as we go along, I'm sure. But of course, no one sought out to do harm.
Correct.
In these spaces, and so let's sort of talk about why that happens. How did that happen? You focus a lot on what you call the moral geometry, this sort of simple calculus that you have a wonderful, I'll quote briefly from your book. You say, moral geometry allows economists to sleep well while others suffer the consequences of their practice. Mm-hmm. So what do you mean by moral geometry?
So since at least the early 20th century, economists have been aware that most policy interventions benefit some people and yet harm others. International trade is a perfect example of that. Economists have known this. And so they've had this moral problem. How do you advocate for policies that are going to cause harm? And some of that harm can be quite serious. And how do you deal with it? The cognitive dissonance that here you are trying to improve the world, and yet that your interventions are also going to cause harm. And how do you do it in a profession where you really want influence? The economics profession, since the end of the 19th century, has been struggling to increase its influence in public policy affairs. The way the economics profession did it is through what I call moral geometry. You take really complex ethical questions, like when is it appropriate to harm some for the benefit of others, and you turn them into simple math problems, cost-benefit analysis, social welfare functions, and the like. You turn them into simple math problems, you do the math, you solve the math problem, and then you render a judgment on policy thinking that you've solved the ethical problem by solving the simple math problem. This is an egregious, I think of this as not just professionally irresponsible. I think of this as professional malpractice. When one considers the nature of those harms, we're talking about the loss of livelihoods and many other things we can talk about, and even lives. I would argue that you can't dismiss the deep ethical issues by turning them into and then solving simple math problems. That's moral geometry. That's a problem.
Let's take one of those pieces, probably the preeminent tool used by economists in the policy world, which is cost-benefit analysis. You've just made reference to that. And sticking with a trade example, everyone understands that a trade agreement, opening of trade, changes in trade rules, well, pretty much changes in any policy, even if they benefit many, will almost certainly harm others. And so there's this question. Now, the question then is, how does one handle that? And talk about the dominant sort of the underlying conception in this calculus is something called Caldor Hicks criterion. So maybe you could say say a few words about what that is. I mean, and why that's problematic.
Okay, good. If the Caldor Hicks is a very simple decision rule. It's a perfect example of moral geometry and all that's wrong with moral geometry. Caldor Hicks says that a policy is good if the gains to the winners are greater than the losses to the losers. If the gains exceed the losses to others. The idea here is, if the gains to the winners are greater than the losses to the losers, then in principle, the winners could fully compensate the losers and still have something left over. If they were to compensate the losers, the idea goes, then the losers are no worse off because they've now been compensated, but the winners have more even after the compensation, so that the policy is a good thing. Of course, the policy, the decision rule does not require that anybody ever compensate anyone. That's been a critique of Caldor Hicks since it was first offered by Caldor and Hicks in the 1930s. But there's a bigger problem. The bigger problem that I draw attention to in my book is this. It presumes that that all harms are in fact compensable. The whole test only works if there's some amount of money that you could give to the people who've been harmed by the policy, such that they're indifferent between the policy with the money and the status quo before the policy was passed. Some harms are compensable, but some harms are not. People die as a consequence of economic policies that economists have reason to advocate for, including trade liberalization. Well, how do you compensate a family who's lost a life? You can't. There's no monetary equivalent to the loss of a child. And yet, that test, Caldor Hicks, is embedded in cost-benefit analysis and is used all the time to adjudicate even when there are non-reparable, non-compensable harms.
So let's unpack this a little further. So you in the book quite elaborate taxonomy of harms and different types of harms, whether you can compensate or not, whether they're reparable or not, whether they're even ethical or not. Talk through. So maybe you have the example of the Treaty of Laramie, I guess, in which the Sioux nations, whose land has been taken and violated, in notwithstanding that treaty, are offered compensation, and they say no, we won't take it. That's one example of something that is, in your view, there's no amount of money that will make this right. Talk through some of the examples of things that you see as things that we really, even if in principle you could in the Caldor Hicks notion, but you actually couldn't compensate people for.
If you go to the taxonomy of harm that I provide in the book, I provide a kind of a rough, loose taxonomy, which tries to show that harms are, when the people suffer an economic harm, such as they're rendered unemployed by a policy like trade liberalization. That's just the first proximate harm. That can then lead to a whole set of what I call cascading harms. They can be other economic harms, like the loss of assets. They may lose their house. There can be political harms. They can lose their political efficacy. They become marginalized. Social harms, autonomy harms. People who are unemployed often, depending on the institutional framework, lose the ability to chart their life course. If they are put in positions of economic precarity where they face instability, they have very little opportunity to chart their life's course, let alone for their children. So they lose autonomy. There is moral damage when a community suffers colonization, for example. The point is this: the initial little harm of losing a job can cascade into all these other kinds of harms, many of which are not compensable, some of which are not reparable. If you lose a loved one, there's no repairing. It's certainly not compensable through money. And if these harms are common in the economy as a consequence of the policies economists advocate for, then in fact we can't use Caldor Hicks in most of the places where we think we should be able to use Caldor Hicks. I would argue that most economic policies have these kinds of knock-on effects, some of which are non-compensable. That's why I call this professional malpractice, to use a tool that presumes compensation in cases where compensation is not possible.
So, part of the plea here, I think, is economists, all of us should take into account these harms, and you make a really strong case, I think, of the complexity of this, the variety of harms, the problem that you've just framed well, that they're not fixable. They're for any price. But the question I want to push back to you is, okay, so admit there are these harms, but you're not saying do no harm. You published in 2011, I think, something called the Economist's Oath. Mm-hmm. And I think it's been unfairly caricatured as the equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath, the do no harm.
Right.
That is not what you're saying. But here's my question for you. So to take a trade agreement or any other thing that we want to talk about, how much, you're not saying do no harm. Mm-hmm. You're saying be aware of the harm, but how much harm is okay? How does one still act if you think somehow on balance, taking into account all of these things, it's still worth doing? Because you're pressing really hard on the harms, but I'm pretty sure you're not saying that means don't do anything.
Correct. I mean, obviously, in an unjust world, or a world with suffering that can be ameliorated, doing nothing causes harm. So I tried so hard in that previous book, and now again in this one, to make the case that I'm not advocating an alternative decision rule to replace Caldor Hicks, like first do no harm. I'm arguing against decision rules, which I think of as moral geometry, that then oversimplify by far the complexity of these kinds of problems. I think you're going to think I'm about to take a pass on your question, which is so hard, because what I'm about to say, Fritz, is what I'm worried about is the role of the positioning of our profession as the harm accountants. I mean, we have taken it onto ourselves to answer the question you just put to me. Then how much harm is okay? What kinds of harms are okay? And I'm thinking that that's not a question that's appropriate for us, we economists, to monopolize. In the end of the book, I talk about, and maybe we'll get to that later on, I talk about new strategies for including the stakeholders more directly in policy assessment. Yep. The principle here is maybe the people whose lives we threaten to upend should be much more centrally involved in making decisions about which harms to risk in pursuit of which social goods. Moving this away from a paternalistic ethos where we economists think we know best. This is the Jeffrey Sachs problem. Thinking we know best and therefore should be able to get on a plane, fly somewhere, tell them what to do, be home by dinner, to a model where those that we purport to serve are more centrally involved in making the calculations. Yes, we'll accept this risk of harm under these given that there are these strategies to ameliorate those harms if they are in fact realized in pursuit of these social goods.
Yeah. Well, I want to come back. We will come back to that because I'm fascinated with the process that you advocate. I think much of the book is a critique of the heroic economist. I think you use that word, the blasé practitioner, but the notion that economists, as you say, have sought influence and sought to position themselves as the experts, and quite apart from these kind of conversations with actual stakeholders and the like. Let's come back to that. I want to move. We've been talking about this problem of unevenness, inequality, of winners and losers. The very very difficult problem that you put your finger on so well. You also spend a good bit of time in the book on what you call irreparable ignorance, which is frightening thought. But so all right. So let's just start with that. What is irreparable? What does that mean? That we're irreparable ignorance.
There are things that, I'm going to sound like a former Secretary of Defense, but there are things that we don't know, but that we can know. That kind of ignorance is reparable. But there are things we don't know that we can't ever know in principle, ever, or that we can't know when we need the knowledge to make the decision, or we can only, cases where we can only gain the knowledge by taking the action that depends on that knowledge. In that case, we always get the knowledge too late because we had to act. The example I give in the book is this: a famished hiker who's been lost in the woods comes across a bush of berries. The hiker has to ask herself, are these berries food or are they poison? The dilemma she faces is that she can only discover the truth of the matter by ingesting the berries when the knowledge is too late. In economics and in the social sciences more generally, and this may be a case in the natural sciences as well, we spend a lot of time thinking about how we gain knowledge of what we know. My argument is that that's not where we should be putting our energy exclusively. We'd better be paying attention to what we cannot know, that we need to know to do much of what it is that we're doing. And if we don't pay attention to what we can't know, and we pretend or we represent or we come to believe that we know the unknowable, we then cause gratuitous harm, avoidable harm that doesn't serve any social purpose, but which is brought about by our hubris.
Let's unpack that a bit. There's a lot of pieces to this. You make a distinction between uncertainty and risk. And risk being, I think, what happens when you toss a dice. We know what the probabilities are. Uncertainty being, there's really no way to. What's the domain of uncertainty? What are the things that we're really uncertain about?
I would say in the social sciences, but my interest obviously is economics. It's vast, and it doesn't get smaller. It gets bigger as we move through time. And there isn't so much to be said here, but let's just let me take one argument from the book that tries to make this case. Here's the standard model that we have in the social sciences. There's a finite amount, think of the area of this box I'm holding up, this rectangle. There's a finite amount of knowledge to be had. When we then know more, we press out, the domain of what we don't know shrinks because the box is already set. So we know more, therefore we don't know less. I argue in the book that that's the wrong way to think about it. When we know more, the interface between what we know and what we need to know, that domain of salient ignorance actually grows. The best example I can give quickly is in technology. Whenever there's a technological innovation, think of AI. In fact, we'll talk about what just happened yesterday. Think of AI. When there's new technologies, we now have new capacities we didn't have before, but that generates all kinds of new questions, the answer to which suddenly becomes salient, important, that we didn't have to worry about before. And I think it was just yesterday that Elon Musk and a bunch of other architects in the AI space, what did they do? They said, stop. Yeah. This technology is moving ahead much faster than our knowledge of its consequences, its risks, its dangers. He's got it exactly right. technological advance creates new ignorance that wasn't there, or that if it was there, it wasn't salient. I mean, Aristotle didn't know the implications of AI, but that ignorance for Aristotle wasn't salient. It wasn't relevant, but boy, is it relevant now.
Oh,
And so the point, new
yeah.
knowledge, Fritz, generates new domains of salient ignorance. And that is a condition that we will confront as long as we
Yeah. So disappointing to discover that. I thought we were getting close to squeezing
perfect
out
knowledge.
but and to realize one actually agrees with Elon Musk, but that's that's another topic. So that's one piece of it, of this irreparable ignorance. Another point you make a number of times in the book is the problem of causal inference. And you say I love that you're gonna know why I like this. Is you say standard causal claims in economics are fictitious in the sense that they depend on fictitious counterfactuals.
Exactly.
So, given my interest in narrative, I was really drawn to that quote. What does that mean?
Well, to claim that, let's say that we claim that one event, let's call it event A, was then a necessary for event B. It was causal in the sense that it was necessary for event B. We see A happen, and then we see B happen, and we want to make the claim that A caused B. But the only way we could ever know it, is to rerun history multiple times. First, where we run the world just as it happened, where A happened and then B happened, but then we'd have to rerun it a second time where A doesn't happen to find out if B doesn't happen. If we could do that, then we would know something about whether A was in fact causal. But here's the problem. History only runs once. And so we can't run history multiple times to see what would happen in another world in which A didn't happen. So how do we do it? We have to mentally simulate it in our heads. This is called counterfactualizing. And the claim in the book, not unique to me by any means, is that to make a causal claim is necessarily to invoke a counterfactual claim about a world that can only exist in our imaginations in which A did not happen. Hence, we spend all this time in the social sciences trying to draw objective causal claims. All of them are based on fantasies and narratives we have in our heads. I ask you then, Fritz, how do we then check to see which of these imaginary worlds is the right one? Answer, there is no way to do it. So at the end of the day, our most certain causal claims in the social sciences are grounded in nothing but our faith in fantasies that we have in our head. That's not to say we shouldn't make counterfactual claims. We can't live without counterfactualizing. It's just to warn us about how insecure our counterfactual and therefore our causal claims are.
Yeah. And I don't think you're claiming we are arguing that only RCTs matter.
RCTs is one of, you can go back through the methods, all the methodological innovations since you and I were in college have all been attempts to solve this counterfactual problem, to figure out what the world would be like if there is the intervention and what the world would be, the identical world would be like if there had been no intervention. All of them fail in principle. Some of them are useful for other reasons, but all of them fail to definitively ever show us whether A caused B.
You go through a number of other things that complicate even further the fact that human beings are unpredictable. They aren't what most economists' models say they are. We are. That is to say, rational, utility maximizing, predictable creatures. There's the whole world, of course, of the policy uptake and the uncertainties of whatever advice the economist gives and how it is interpreted and used and implemented in the policy world. It paints a very bleak picture. Go ahead. You want to jump in on that? Yeah.
This is a lesson I learned from our colleague Rachel Epstein, because in my early work, I was always talking about the power of economists. And she had just done this great dissertation, which became a great book, to look to see when it was the case that institutions like NATO did have influence in target countries and when it didn't. And she said to me, George, you're talking about power as if economists can pull levers and make things happen.
Right.
And as soon as she said it, I realized that I had fallen into the trap of associating influence with control. And the fact of the matter is, what I learned from this interaction with her is that what we enjoy in economics is a lot of influence and zero control. And that is a really dangerous situation to confront. Because as you were just starting to say before I cut you off, it means that I can do great economic analysis, throw it out there in the world, and then see it undermined in 15 different ways so that the consequences are fundamentally different from what I had intended.
Yeah, and of course the once one knows that, and this is something you've just written about before, the temptation of the economist is to manipulate the policy world, perhaps by overstating the claim in order to, because it's right, but cutting a few corners. I think you call it prosocial lying in a chapter of a forthcoming book. So it's fascinating, this whole interface. In fact, it's useful to note that, because I think, as we'll talk in just a minute, a centerpiece of the alternative approach you have is really gets at this relationship between the economist and the stakeholders in the policy world in a somewhat different way. But what I want to ask you, I want to turn to that now, but okay, so this is a really bleak picture, right? It feels like we can't know anything, But you make some causal claims in the book. You made some earlier on about the relationship between trade policy and outcomes. You referenced Jeffrey Sachs, who's the villain of the story about Russia and the rapid, shock liberalization. You have a reference to the austerity program imposed on Greece and its implications. So you make these causal claims to some extent in the book. So how do we get around this? I mean, we have to have some theory of causality, don't we, in order to make those kinds of judgments?
Mm-hmm. It's like counterfactualizing. We can't live without causal claims, and yet we have to be aware that our causal claims are grounded in fictitious claims narratives that we have in our head. But we can't get around making those causal claims. Part of the issue for me is, where does causation reside? I'm looking out my window at the world. Does causation reside out there? Is the world actually this is, economists, we shouldn't be talking about ontology, Fritz, but I'm going to do it for
Okay.
Is the world structured in a way that the world is organized around causal relationships, or is causality a concept that resides in our head that we bring to the world to be able to appropriate the world to make it useful for us? I would argue that the latter is the case, that causality is our best attempt to manage this, the world beyond us. It's not a property of the world, it's a property in our minds. If one takes that view, then one becomes a lot more humble in a hurry about one's causal claims, because one knows that they're never going to be grounded in or proven by reference to what's out there. They're going to work well, and so we'll use our causal claims until they don't work well. And that's when things can go so very wrong. So it's a matter of humility and knowing that we have to live with something that is necessarily fraught. That's imperfectly how I think about it.
Yeah, well, I think, ultimately your book, to me, reads as a plea for humility, if nothing else. We need to be aware of all of these things. There's so many ways we can do things wrong. There's so much we don't know. There's these, et cetera. And so pushing back at the hubris of economists and those who follow their advice. All right, so I want to turn to you sketch out an alternative to the kind of moral geometry approach. And as you referenced it earlier, this is decision making under deep uncertainty. That's school of thought that you didn't originate, but certainly contributing to it. So let's just start there. What is, it's commonly called DMDU. What is DMDU?
DMDU is decision making under deep uncertainty. The presumption is that we live, the chief presumption is the one that we've been discussing just now, which is that the world is fundamentally unknowable in ways that we would need to know it. And so this isn't just an abstract problem. This is a concrete problem. We need to know what to do today to ameliorate or to prevent climate change or to deal with the consequences. And yet when you move into those kinds of questions, we are overwhelmed with imponderables. DMDU asks the question, what if we lead with what we can't know? How could we then, as quote unquote experts, social scientists, natural scientists, engineers and the like, how could we inform good policymaking decision if we lead with what we don't know? If you ask that question, well, at least when they ask that question, I've been asking myself that question for a decade and couldn't answer it. When they ask themselves that question, they quickly move toward the idea that we should be looking for policies that are robust, not efficient. So forget about where marginal revenue, social benefit cuts marginal social cost. Let's think about a policy that can do well enough across many, many, many diverse futures where we don't ever assign probabilities to any one of those futures. Point one. Point two, the moral issue, and this is so fundamental for me in the book, as you know, they ask themselves, once we run an exercise like checking different policies to see how they might perform against 20, 30,000 possible futures, this is done in a computationally rich way.
Right.
When one does that, who then should be the decision makers about which policies to endorse? Because it's understood that any policy, no matter how robust it might appear, may go wrong. And so the strategy is built around stakeholder involvement at every step of the deliberation. It's a deliberation that never ends, because once the policy is instituted, we then have to monitor the world to see, is the world evolving in a direction where that policy is going to fail, and then adjust. And this means, Fritz, that the economist has to have skin in the game. They can't just write a cost-benefit analysis, get paid for it, and walk away. They are embedded in a community of stakeholders who will then manage this problem moving through time. That's the ideal. It replaces the paternalism of our profession in thinking we should be the harm accountants with an approach that's collaborative, where we are empowering those who stand to be harmed to inform the decision-making policy process in meaningful ways.
Many things attractive about that. Let me ask you a few questions about it. So one is you argued, you just did I think for policies that are kind of robust across multiple scenarios. They may satisfice, they may not be optimal.
Correct.
But that they well, you frame it a couple of different ways. One is in sort of they minimize regret. They avoid some of the worst outcomes. I'm again, so the notion is one generates many scenarios and pathways, and then somehow decides on something that is avoiding the worst in some ways while doing pretty well. It feels like a very risk-averse strategy. And at the extreme, it's kind of maxi-min in game theoretic terms. You're not saying that, right? You're not saying avoid. We have one scenario in which something truly horrible happens. We absolutely can't do that thing. I mean, how does one weight these things is a question that I have.
The answer is one doesn't. And that's the key. There's no arbiter who says, in this case, we shall pursue a maxi-min, this case, mini-max, or what. Right. There are no decision rules here. What there are deliberators who at various stages then ask themselves, okay, this policy might be the most robust, but does it require too much of us? Are we willing to take the risk of what appears to be a less robust policy because there's windfall gains to be had from that alternative policy? but it's not Fritz Mayer or George DeMartino making that decision. And it's a collaborative, I mean, in the ideal, and you could point to me the 50,000 problems with this, I get. But in the ideal, it's a collaborative process where I mean stakeholders, those who stand to be most directly affected, are the ones who are making those trade-offs.
We could talk at further length about the details of it, but let me Cass Sunstein reviewed your book in New York Review of Books, and he said a lot of things, but you know, some of it was, well, your DeMartino's being just too hard on the profession. We're actually doing a lot of these things. We're taking, you know, we do think about distribution some and the like. But there was also sort of a sense in which, wow, you're asking a lot of us, you know, like this is really hard. This is really complicated. And I'm not sure I agree with him, but let me press that point. I mean, what you propose is like, this is really hard. I got to think about all kinds of harms. I got to think about all kinds of things I can't know. And then that's the, you know, we've got to generate a lot of, you know, and then I've got to enter into this this deliberative process with stakeholders and the like. Wow, that's hard. Are you saying, you know, is this how we should be making all our decisions? Should we reserve, are there certain kinds of decisions that have enough? Well, that's costly, right? That's an enormous amount of time, whether it's the economist or the policymaker or whomever's involved with that kind of process. Are you saying that, you know, where does this apply, or where should this apply in your view?
All right, you've asked a lot, actually, so let me see if I can pick it apart.
Yeah, I packed a couple of them in there at once.
That's okay.
And I should say to our audience, I did that because we're starting to run short on time. I do want to get to questions, so please put them in the Q&A, and we can get to as many as we can.
Fritz, for 150 years, our profession has sought influence, to increase its influence. My argument that grounds all of this is that we've let that pursuit of influence run ahead of our consideration of the responsibilities you take on as a profession when you succeed in getting that influence. Well, we were massively successful in getting that influence up until Trump. Trump was not interested in what we have to say. But up until Trump, we were massively successful in achieving influence, and yet our profession wants more influence. My argument is we have too much influence relative to the state of our thinking about what are our responsibilities to the people we purport to serve, where we are in position to help them, but we are definitely also in position to harm them. So taking a step back, you know, getting rid of the executive order that requires that every regulation and policy be run through a cost-benefit mill. That, you know, this whole, we have thousands of economists in the world, all over the world, doing cost-benefit analysis every day that they themselves don't even believe in, because of regulation that says this is what they should be doing. Let's get rid of that regulation. If we're going to have a regulation, let's start talking about how about having them do robustness tests rather than cost-benefit analysis tests. And yes, what about having them look at inequality effects as the primary thing they're looking at, not a little add-on in chapter 17 of page 57 of a cost-benefit analysis. So yes, it's asking a lot, but look, we created this mess, if I may say so, where we have more influence than we deserve, and we have more influence than we are prepared to bear. And the consequences of that are not good.
Well, you know, this is, you know, you and I are largely in agreement. As someone, I've taught policy analysis for years, and I always made it as complicated as possible. And one of my lines is that too much is wrong in the world because people have taken one semester of microeconomics. That's you know, but there it is. Again, welcome people to all of you, or ask any of you who have questions, put them in the Q&A. Let me, would love to talk further about that. I want to just talk very briefly about teaching, because you are, you know, a marvelous teacher, and I know that from the testimonial of so many of your students. You're teaching people who are, you know, of our master's students who are going on to be practitioners. So this is real relevance, right? Uh, what kind of practitioners do you hope our students become?
Yeah, a very good question. Well, obviously humble. Um, I I want them to be aware that there are not settled in terms of economics, because I'm thinking of students who may be engaging in the economic realm in one way or another. I want students to be aware that there are no settled truths in economics. There are narratives. And these narratives have consequences, and that when they come up against an economist, I guess let me restart my answer. I guess now I realize the answer. I'm preparing them to deal with economists. That's what I should have said. And the way I do it is by teaching them that there are no established truths in economics. There are narratives, there are arguments, there are claims. I try to show them all the assumptions one must hold in order to reach the conclusion that trade has this effect, not that effect, because I want them to go into the room and not be bullied by economists who presume that they know best. I want our students to be literate in economics, but not just in knowing what they know, also in knowing the limitations to what they know. I think that this is what we should expect of, this is what we should be training our citizens to be, not just MA students who are going to go off and make their careers doing economics. I'll end there. There's so much more to be said about this question, Fritz, but I'll stop.
Well, I think our audience can see through the whole talk why you are such a marvelous teacher, and there's a lot more we could talk about. Would love to do that. I did promise people that I would get to questions, so I have them in the chat. I have to put my glasses on to read them here on my screen. So let's take a couple of these questions here. Oh, so we'll start with for the Luddites felt they were being harmed, so they went on a rampage, smashing the automated spinning and weaving machines, which also harmed the capitalists. Should the innovations that would make certain professions redundant be restrained or delayed? If so, what could be the criteria and the parameters?
Good. Yeah, this is a debate that I have with Deirdre McCloskey, who is a liberal economist in the tradition of Hayek and von Mises, the Austrian school. And she makes this argument all the time that, yeah, okay, look, there were some buggy, those horse and drawn buggy wheel makers who lost their jobs in the context of technological change. But you know what, so what? Because as a consequence of these technological changes, we are now today hundreds of times better off than we otherwise would have been. And this kind of utilitarian calculation really drives me crazy. It is the logic of every utopian, every ideologue, I should say, not utopian, every ideologue who thought that they knew what was best and who were therefore willing to bear the costs impose the costs on whoever had to bear them so as to achieve this heaven on earth that they knew was in the best interest of all. You know, I am with Robert Nozick, another great liberal philosopher, who says, you know, he's criticizing people, ideologues like that, and he says, utopia is where our grandchildren will live. And I think that's so right. He's saying, you know, utopians or ideologues are often willing to just cash in one generation or one part of society for the welfare of others. And in that name, all kinds of atrocities gets done. Now, to get to the question, were the Luddites, do I understand the Luddites' motivations? Absolutely. Are there times when technology should be slowed down? Absolutely. Does the free market provide adequate protections to make sure things don't go too fast? Never. And that's why what Elon Musk and the others did yesterday was so interesting. Here are the principal beneficiaries of this AI saying it's going too fast. We need to slow down. The great theorist of this, of course, was Karl Polanyi in the book, The Great Transformation, who said, you know, a beneficial change, if it happens too quickly, can be devastating. So we have to pay attention not just to the direction of history, but also to the speed at which, let's say, technological innovations are introduced. Yep. We may enter a period of the next 20 years of complete misery because of the overly fast introduction of AI into our world.
Yeah. We could talk at length about the speed of transitions. I think you and I were talking beforehand about the encounter I had with the former finance minister of Mexico when I was involved with the NAFTA project, and he was speaking with my boss, who was Bill Bradley, about the pace with which agriculture would transform in Mexico. At that time, about 30% of the population of Mexico in agriculture, and Bradley says to him, "Oh, that was true in the U.S. 100 years ago." And then in a matter of 25 or 30 years, we went from 30 to 10%. And Aspie said, "Oh, was it difficult?" And Bradley said, "I have a few books for you to read." These transitions are and of course, economists don't think about transitions. They think about equilibrium condition, typically, are not thinking about the.
Can I just say one thing on that,
Yeah.
Fritz, because this is so important. The image that economists have about innovation that's going to cause harm, it's like when you throw a pebble into a pond, the initial ripples are big, but they quickly dissipate. So that the harms are short-term, and so we can think of them just as short-term transition periods. But some of the harms cascade. They compound. They get bigger, like an avalanche moving down a mountain, and they can be transmitted through generations. This is the case with austerity policy, for instance, where the children of those who lose their jobs during austerity are going to be worse off than their parents. If you understand that some harms actually compound over time, they're not like ripples on a pond, then you can't use cost-benefit analysis in Caldor Hicks so cavalierly, because you're dismissing the long-term damage, which may be much worse than the short-term damage.
Yeah, and now I'm failing my audience, by not getting enough questions. I'll just, with apologies for all of you, there's some great questions in the Q&A. Love the conversation of robustness versus efficiency. Stakeholder input is so important and endless. What do you think of how to manage the time trade-off with taking such a robust approach? Yeah.
Well, I think that there is a cost. This kind of, especially when you're transitioning toward this kind of an approach and you've got to gear up and all the rest, there is definitely a cost. But when we talk about time, we're talking months, not years and years. And for the kinds of wicked problems we confront, like climate change, if you told me that within 9 months we could have strategies in place that would generate much better decisions, much more robust decisions, I'd say that that's 9 months well worth taking.
Can you speak about the increased harm to countries who greatly benefited from rapid trade liberalization, who may have seen vastly more suffering as a result of a slower pace of globalization? And I might, let's take China, for example, or not just for example. China's more than an example. Didn't China benefit enormously from rapid trade liberalization? Life expectancy, abject poverty down, life expectancy up, et cetera. Anyway, I'm now adding to the question.
Yeah, no, but I think that I'm glad this question was raised. China did so well, let's be clear, not by following the prescriptions of our best trade theorists, but essentially by cheating. They were able to not cheat. By not following the prescriptions, the neoliberal prescriptions, they did an extraordinary job of managing this transition to an open economy and exploiting it to benefit from it, while at the same time insulating itself from what could have been its most damaging effects. This was not a neoliberal economy, nor is it now. But what China has done, from a moral, if one's judging policy in terms of lifting people out of poverty, as we should, what China's done is extraordinary, and it was able to exploit trade openness by countries around the world. That's all to the good. Does that mean that we had to impose such extraordinary suffering in the United States on communities that were harmed and in some cases destroyed by trade liberalization? Of course not. We could have, our profession, my profession, could have been advocating for this. Let's develop the kind of policies that are going to be necessary to take those North Carolina textile workers who are going to lose their jobs and actually have in place the means to build a new economy in place of what was leaving, at home, not requiring them to migrate to San Francisco, but at home. And let's develop these kinds of mechanisms, and then let's endorse trade liberalization. What my profession did instead is this. Paul Krugman, for instance. Yes, trade liberalization. And oh, by the way, we should have some trade adjustment on the side. That trade adjustment, TAA for its trade
Adjustment assistance. Yeah,
trade adjustment assistance.
exactly.
It never came in anything like
Yeah.
to the degree that it was required.
Yeah, yeah. You and I talked before. I had worked with Robert Reich when I was a grad student. He was in during the big trade bills in NAFTA and the creation of the WTO. He was Secretary of Labor, and so engaged a bit with him. And it was he supported those trade liberalization, but he imagined and hoped that there would be, the kind of thing that you just described, much more massive investment in communities that would almost certainly lose from trade liberalization generally. But the politics of this were very complicated, and it didn't happen, as you said. All right, so maybe one more in the time we have. Let's take this one. So how can Marxian economics overcome the stigma associated with the past? You referenced the fact that you found a professor at Harvard, probably the last one, with Marxist training. And in particular, how has that school of thought itself changed and influenced normative economics in the past, here it says 10 years?
One would have hoped that the end of the Cold War might have opened the door to greater openness around the ideas of not just Marx, but people, critics of the free market system like Marx. And but it didn't happen in economics. Obviously, in anthropology, sociology, and some of our other social sciences and the humanities, we find lots of great scholars doing interesting work in the Marxian tradition. In economics, those who are trained in Marx or have a compassion for Marx get essentially pushed aside and marginalized. But I have to say that Marx continues to be rediscovered over and over, and not just by quote unquote Marxists. I've been giving a talk lately. It's called "Come Back, Marx, All Is Forgiven," and the reason I use that title is because that's the title of an article in the London Times, a mainstream newspaper. And I then started to look around to other mainstream newspapers or magazines or periodicals, and even those that serve the business community. And I found that, this was right after Thomas Piketty's book on inequality. There were articles everywhere in the mainstream press where people were starting to say, wait, did Marx actually understand something that we've lost in economics, and what can we recover from Marx? So the door has been reopened recently because of the new attention to the inequality that is just mind-bendingly difficult to wrap your mind around within the neoclassical framework, but which Marx was talking about quite eloquently 130, 40 years ago. So there's hope. There's hope. Yes, the Marxian tradition has evolved in all kinds of ways that I can't engage in here now.
Well, we alas are at the allotted hour. George, really a pleasure talking with you. Just scratched the surface of your book and your thinking, but thanks so much for being with us today. And let me thank everyone in the audience for being with us as well. So thank you, George, and thank you all.
And thanks for me too. Thank you.
All right.